Habib Wardak, welcome to India again. I hope we're being good hosts to you the same way that Afghans are to us when we travel to your country. If you can get straight to the topic, which is President Trump's conducting strategic policy through tweets. What is your reading of the whole situation post that?
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be in India. We call it our second home. President Trump and his policy of tweeting whatever that needs to be done through his Twitter, the Afghans are astonished. For a good short period of time, there was this belief in Afghanistan that peace might finally return back to this country because every Afghan was following the peace process and Qatar very closely, because we're talking about a country called Afghanistan that has been in this invincible sort of conflict for the past 18 years. But it took...
The Taliban also said they were astonished by it.
And so were the Afghans, because the Afghans are exhausted and tired of this invincible war since 1978. We are talking about millions of Afghans killed, millions other migrated to different parts of the world. You look at it from the other perspective, there's no country in the world who has so many of its citizens migrated, speaking in terms of percentage, as Afghans have. Every day we have civilian casualties from the Taliban side, from the US-led coalition, Afghan government side. For this one brief moment, Afghans thought that maybe this could end very well. But like I said, 2 tweets sort of put an end to the process. As an Afghan, I have a firm conviction that all it will take is another 2 tweets to go back and restart the process, because I firmly believe that Taliban, as an Afghan local phenomena, it's impossible to uproot them. We have had 150,000 plus international boots on the ground. What they call it is the Obama surge in 2009 and 2010. And you still had an intensifying insurgency. That insurgency did not get tamed. And now what you have is around 15,000 troops. The belief is that it's impossible to uproot and eradicate the Taliban. What you can do is maybe perhaps here and there contain them, but not eradicate them. So it will always be a wise decision to go back and start that process and maybe somehow put an end to this invincible conflict.
Though President Trump has gone on record in front of the camera saying these talks are dead, as far as I'm concerned, they're dead. But there are other noises coming out of the State Department. Secretary Pompeo has given several interviews. The Taliban themselves have given interviews, whether it's in Qatar and now even in Russia, where they've gone. There are indications that both sides not only could go back, but need to go back.
Yes, they should go back. This is what we have been saying. Leaving Afghanistan from the United States perspective, just like that, because Trump always says that he will withdraw and he will leave. This is what he has pledged and promised to the American public, is what we call is a premature withdrawal, which will expose Afghanistan to all sorts of other conflicts internally. So it would always be wise to leave Afghanistan, where you engage with the Taliban, get into some sort of an agreement, where you have guarantees and counter guarantees in place, which will sort of avoid a situation where you are where the Afghans could go into another sort of internal conflict, which we cannot afford, because like I said, it's already been 40 years we have been dwelling in this conflict.
But if you look at it from the US perspective, is there any chance of it being something like no deal Brexit? That is, you don't have a deal and still withdraw. This is coming after NSA Bolton has been sacked. He was one of the proponents of that kind of.
So Bolton was somebody who opposed the Afghan deal, like he opposed the Iranian deal, like he opposed deal with the North Koreans. But I think you do have people in the US establishment, such as Pompeo, Ambassador Khalilzad themselves, who has a deep understanding of the situation, the conflict, and I think they'll be very sort of beneficial in convincing Trump that you cannot just pull the plug on out of Afghanistan. We still need to sort of negotiate, engage with the Taliban, and I think ultimately that is what will happen. Coming back to your question, I think I look at this whole situation where somewhere down the line, hopefully sooner than later, the US will come back and start engaging with the Taliban. This process will kick off again.
Yeah, we are told that Zalmay Khalilzad and the Taliban still have communication channels open even now.
This is what we have read as well, where the negotiating teams are still in contact with each other. The statement that came from the Qatar office, where they said that they were astonished because of the tweets, they also said that they are still in regular contact with the negotiating teams from the US State Department. It even went to the extent where they said that they have asked for clarifications from the US Department of State negotiators. So, yes.
You have done a lot of work and you have obviously a lot of experience. Give us the insight into the mind of the Taliban, if we can call it that.
So, in what sense would you want me to?
What are they looking for? At what point are we at? Have they changed their negotiation?
So,
how should they be part of the Afghan setup?
So, looking at the statements that keeps coming from the Taliban office, where they keep saying that they'll talk to each side, they'll talk to every group, they'll talk to every political party, and whatever sort of negotiations we are talking about, whatever sort of deals we are talking about, speaking in terms of the intra-Afghan dialogue, the Taliban has been very clear that every group will be talked to, and we're talking about a system where everybody could reflect themselves in whatever that future system we are talking about.
But do you and Afghans believe they're trustworthy in what they're saying?
So some of the indications that are coming, they're very positive. The Taliban acknowledges that they're not the Taliban of 1996. We are talking about 2019 now. We are talking about a younger generation in Afghanistan who has traveled the world, who are highly educated now. So the Taliban do understand that they have to be to accommodate themselves within the aspirations of these younger generation Afghans. Speaking in terms of their view about women's education, participation in economics, politics, civil society, they believe and they do say that they will respect that. As far as they are in the norms of the Afghan culture and Islam, which is improvement. We look at it as an improvement, and they have also sort of we have had statements coming from the Qatar office. He said once that about the dissolving of the ANDSF, but later on they rectified it, saying that we will ensure that the relatively stable, the relatively functioning institutions that we have in Afghanistan should not be damaged. Because, to be very frank, for Taliban, the best case study to look at would not be anywhere else but Afghanistan in 1992, where you had the Mujahideen now coming into Kabul. The institutions were destroyed. That led to a very brutal era in Kabul between 1992 and 1996 until the Taliban emerged, where you had women who were being raped, their breasts being cut off, people were burned in containers, you had women jumping from the apartments of Makroyan because you might have some warlord coming in and raping them. The Taliban should clearly and very cautiously study that period in order to avoid such a phenomena again in the future. And they acknowledge that, they understand that, and my understanding is, and my hope is, that they should be very careful about it.
Most people say that to address the problem in Afghanistan, to stop violence, the root cause is actually to look across the Durand line to Pakistan, support sanctuaries for the Taliban and other groups. How much control does Pakistan have over the Taliban? And if the Taliban reintegrates into Afghan government, Afghan society, do you visualize them moving out of the orbit of Rawalpindi, GHQ, ISI?
So you're talking about control. I always look at it an influence, and influence do not necessarily translates into control. There's no doubt that what you have in Pakistan is the Quetta Shura. There is no doubt that what you have in Pakistan is the Peshawar Shura and the Waziristan Shura and whatnot. But when we talk about the re-emergence of the Taliban movement or the insurgency in Afghanistan after 2004 and 2005, we cannot say it's the Pakistanis who did it. It was because of the local environment in Afghanistan. You had people who were now sitting in Kabul who were tasked with this job of ensuring that democracy thrives in Afghanistan with all its values, who did not have that capacity to thrive democracy in Afghanistan. You had U.S. nitrate operations. You had weak and corrupt judicial system, which led to a lot of grievances in rural Afghanistan and started turning back towards Taliban. That helped Taliban to reassemble itself. Speaking in terms of the future Taliban and their relationship with Pakistan, you will have opposing views about this. The way I look at it personally is that I look at Taliban as a local phenomena, as a reality as a ground reality with Pakistani influence, and that's because they had nowhere else to go after 2001. They were fighting an insurgency. Pakistan had their interests, but then you compare them and you sort of analyze the contemporary situation where they have ensured that they sort of act independently, where they started talking to Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, that have given them the Indonesians and a lot more. The office in Qatar has given them that liberation and that freedom. You've had Pakistan selling the Taliban to the US-led coalition. Mullah Zaif is a good example. You had Taliban leaders who were tortured in Pakistani jails.
Mullah Ubaidullah was in jail for 8 years.
Yes, and he made it to Qatar now. The other example is the Taliban former defense minister, Mullah Ubaidullah, a stalwart among the Taliban ranks, who was killed in Pakistani jail. So they will not forget that. And how they have changed is looking at Mohammed bin Salman's visit to Pakistan, where he had his own aspirations as for how this peace process should be carried forward, where the Taliban refused to meet them along with the Pakistani leadership. Looking at the Kashmir's 372 and 35A, where you had elements in Pakistan who wanted to link Kashmir with Afghanistan, and then suddenly you had a statement coming from the Taliban saying that you just cannot link Kashmir with the Afghan peace process or the Afghan insurgency. They have matured a lot. They have been through a lot, and my understanding is that they would do everything it takes to sort of have a neutral approach as far as understanding the regional security, regional politics, regional relations, and they have improved on that. And their statement, looking at their statements, their view is that they would want to have peaceful relations with all the countries, and they will ensure that Afghanistan is not used as a safe haven or as a tool to be used against other countries. So they're very clear about that.
But Pakistan has its own interests. Its interest would either be to control an organization or a group that has a lot of power in Kabul, right?
Yes. So now we are talking about this whole concept of proxy states. We are talking about the concept of satellite state, the Pakistani outlook towards Afghanistan. But the question is, will the Taliban allow that in the future? Because they have very good experience of 96 to 2001, where they were neglected by so many countries because of their links with the likes of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations in Pakistan. And they gained a lot from Pakistan between that period of 96 to 2001, where their finances, their logistics, their ammunition to fight that war. But also they lost a lot because of that option. So I think they'll be very prudent and cautious when we talk about in the future, and they're very firm about it.
If the US even goes back to the negotiating table with the Taliban, and then the intra-Afghan dialogue, which was supposed to happen in 2013 in Oslo, but God knows whether how that will be delayed. But in terms of Pakistan pushing its own agenda, do you see Daesh, ISIS? Is that a plan B? Is that an insurance policy if the Taliban move out of control of Rawalpindi, of Pakistan, that they continue to have some kind of control over creating chaos?
So you're using the word control again, and I would say
You will say
influence.
influence, right?
Yes. One of the reasons that the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese started to become interested in talks with the Taliban was primarily because of the Daesh phenomena. There's also an understanding that the Taliban were far more effective in fighting Daesh than the US-led coalition along with the Afghan government security forces. This whole process gave Taliban leverage. It gave them some breathing space and liberation out of Pakistan. Daesh is a threat in Afghanistan, but not as much as it's propagated. Because if you look at Afghanistan, we follow a traditional Islam sort of way of Islam, and you do have these small pockets of Wahhabi Salafi population in Afghanistan where Daesh is currently active in. But beyond that, I don't see much of Daesh thriving in Afghanistan. I think that's a little bit hyped. But if you're talking about conflict in Afghanistan and we get to reach some sort of peace settlement with the Taliban, I think 90% of Afghanistan's security problems will get solved. What we will be left with is Daesh, and then it becomes a whole lot easier to dismantle, eradicate, and uproot Daesh. The other thing with Daesh is that it's not a local phenomenon in Afghanistan, unlike the Taliban movement, which makes it difficult for Daesh to live, prosper, and thrive in Afghanistan.
But can still create a lot of chaos. We saw what happened in Syria and Iraq. They may not have been local. They were imported from all over the world, from the West.
Yes, just like I said, Afghanistan is not Syria. It's not Iraq. We're altogether different people. There are religious differences. You don't have a lot of Salafi and Wahhabi pockets in Afghanistan, and it makes it difficult for the Daesh to prosper. And the other thing is the perception of general Afghans towards Daesh, be it in urban Afghanistan or rural Afghanistan. It's not they're not comfortable at all. They're detested. If given option, it's a silly sort of analogy, but if you would say pick between Taliban or Daesh, any day Taliban, because it's a local phenomena, it's from Afghanistan, and Daesh, they look at it as a Salafi movement, as a Wahhabi movement, and most of the time you will even have Afghans who will say Daesh is a Western project, which is not meant for Afghanistan. It's supposed to be shipped into Central Asia and then subsequently the Russian Federation, so they're not meant for Afghanistan. But let me reiterate again that if we get to reach some sort of an agreement with the Taliban, Daesh will become irrelevant, because now the whole focus will be towards Daesh, and they'll become irrelevant.
You mentioned regional countries like Iran, Russia, China engaging with the Taliban, giving them even more international legitimacy. India seems to have changed its so-called red lines to a certain extent, but is still following the traditional way of diplomacy, which is you support a legitimate quote-unquote government, elected government in Afghanistan and that process. And if there are intra-Afghan talks, then maybe India should engage with the Taliban. Because India has so much love in Afghanistan. So what do Afghans really want in terms of India's involvement in this peace process and further?
Well, I think it should not be a bad idea if, just like the Chinese are speaking to the Taliban, just like the Iranians, which are your close partners, speaking to the Taliban, the Russians are now speaking to the Taliban. Why would India not speak to the Taliban? This is not a bad idea. India have been of tremendous help to the Afghans over the past 18 years. They have contributed, they have helped in building the Afghan infrastructure. We are talking about Salma Dam, we are talking about highways, we are talking about healthcare.
Project.
Absolutely. Um, and India should not look at the Taliban from the lens of Pakistan. You're talking about a phenomena that is local, that has vested interests in Afghanistan, that is of the Afghan origins. So why not speak to them? And if you're talking about uh, a peaceful Afghanistan, we're talking about peace negotiations, we're talking about inculcating Taliban into the political process in the future. Why should it be a bad idea to talk to the Taliban and not look at it from the Pakistani perspective for once?
Where does all this leave the poll process and democracy in Afghanistan? Because as of now, it seems if talks are not continued in any manner, the polls will go on, at least the process will go on. Where does that leave? Is it giving President Ghani more legitimacy that there's no peace deal?
President Ghani has been very firm about elections. He has a clear vision that elections needs to happen, and he needs to come to power for another 5 years. And he has now even been very vocal about having this idea of republic being the red line. We are living in a country where you have 47% of your territory or more either in the Taliban control or contested. Now, what you have is that the Afghan constitution that we now follow in Afghanistan, Article 12, under the fundamental rights, it states that every Afghan has the right to elect or be elected. Now, in 47% of your territory where you have Taliban control or it's contested, that means the state has failed in providing an enabling environment for people to participate in elections. That challenges the very legality of the elections, because now you'll have people living and dwelling in that 47% of your territory not reflecting and themselves in the political process. And on the other side, what you have is that insecurity will pave the path for stuffing ballots, rigging, and all sorts of abnormalities and irregularities that you can think of. This could very well challenge the outcome of the elections, which will not help anybody but the Taliban. So why not engage with the Taliban, and where you're just focusing on elections? Because all of the electoral reforms that we are talking about since 2014 has not taken place. A good example is the 2018 parliamentary elections. It turned out to be a mess. Lack of participation, rigging, stuffing of ballots, and even it went to sexual abuse allegations. So I don't know how different are we in 2019. The other thing is that you have one major political candidate who has backed out of the election, saying that peace is far more important. You have Abdullah saying that if it's about peace, he's willing to forget about elections, whereas President Ghani is stuck to the notion of ensuring that elections happen, and it's for obvious reasons. Um, what all Afghans believe in is that peace is far more important than elections, because it has been 40 years. You do have these notions, with all due respect, where on March 8th is International Women's Day, where you have people celebrating um, Women's Day. And in rural Afghanistan, you have an air raid that has happened, more of a bombing of a house where a woman has died with three of her children in her lap. So what happens to those women rights? Beyond everything, it's about human rights. We need to ensure that human dignity and human life, that needs to be restored in Afghanistan. We just cannot afford having 200 to 300 coffins sent to mothers and wives across Afghanistan. Some part of the ANDSF, some Taliban fighters, and majority of them general Afghans, civilians. That needs to be stopped in the very first place, and that will only stop if we get to reach some sort of agreement with the Taliban.
You talked about the youth. Now, median age in Afghanistan is probably 18. You're the youngest country outside Africa. 35. You're representing the youth as well. Many who are 18 or so old have not seen the Taliban or have not personally witnessed them in power. What does the youth in Afghanistan really want, and how do they think it should be achieved?
So let me divide the Afghan youth. So you have the urban youth and you have the rural youth. It has got to an extent where the urban youth cannot travel to rural Afghanistan. The rural youth cannot travel to urban Afghanistan. The biggest desire for the Afghan youth is to travel across the country. The youth in Afghanistan is restricted to their own dwellings. Sometimes they cannot even travel around in urban Afghanistan because you're scared of a suicide attack. In rural Afghanistan, you are basically scared of a drone attack that might hit you because you happen to be somewhere. The youth aspiration is that this bloodshed needs to stop. When we are talking about NDSF casualties, who are they? It's the Afghan youth. When we were talking about Taliban
50,000
fighters,
since 2014,
or perhaps more.
or perhaps more official
Yes.
figure.
Taliban fighters, who are they? 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old Afghan youth. It's fine if they are from rural Afghanistan, but they are the Afghan youth. We're talking about civilian casualties. We're talking about children who are killed. These are all the Afghan youth. And if a sensible Afghan young man is to look at this whole thing, his priority number one will be ensuring the dignity and respect to life. And that will only happen if we can get to reach some sort of peace agreement. You do have hawks, like you have everywhere in the rest of the world, who still believe that a slight more pressure, a slight more intensity in the drone strikes and night operations might as well push the Taliban or end this conflict, which is nothing but utopia.
Wardak, again, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much
Thank you
for
very
speaking.
much. It was always a pleasure.